She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. Forgot a crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country.
All right. Hey, good day, everybody. And I know this is all new. This is a new setup for you guys. And I just want to welcome you to this new program. It's called Anansi Web Education. It's basically to talk about the village movement in Guyana and the importance of that, the villages, the pooling up, purchasing of villages, and so forth across Guyana by our African ancestors, and how important that is. With me on this program, I will be interviewing former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Arthur Granger. And if we can have quickly our operator to have Mr. Granger right into the studio so that we can begin this inaugural program, Anansi Web Education. Let's welcome President David Arthur Granger. How are you, sir?
Well, it's good to be here, and it's good to be embarking on this new venture on your platform. I think it's something which is needed, and I look forward to having a successful engagement with you and other persons about Anansi's Web. It's very important to all Guyanese, not just Africans, and this is a good start. As the Chinese say, you know, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and this is the first single step.
And today is definitely that first step. And you did say that we will have other folks join in terms of this conversation, where we're sitting and we're having this conversation about the villages that were bought by our African ancestors, the importance of that. But before we get into that, Anansi, tell us a little bit about the name of this program, Anansi. I know it's Anansi Web Education, but why Anansi?
Anansi is an authentic Akan word. Well, not Akan. The language of the Akan people is Twi, but the Akan people, the word for spider is Anansi. Anansi simply means spider. It is not a story. It's a creature called. It's a creature. It's a spider, and over a period of time, the Akan people developed a lot of stories, mostly to teach their children about the feats of Anansi. You know, that here was the smallest creature in the jungle, using his intelligence to outsmart the big, powerful beasts, you know, the jaguars and the snakes. And here was this weak insect who could easily be crushed, using his intelligence, not for evil purposes, but using his intelligence to improve the whole community and, of course, to save his own life. So in Guyana, in Jamaica, in Barbados, we've all inherited the Anansi stories as lessons of life. And here in Guyana, on this program, we're looking forward to seeing how uneducated, dispossessed people coming out of the worst crime against humanity, that is enslavement, using their intelligence. Some of them were illiterate, but using their intelligence to build a future that has lasted for over 200 years, and many of the African villages were bought by illiterate people. But like Anansi, they use their intelligence and their vision to provide for posterity. And I think that's explains the relevance of the program at this time.
Thank you so much for those who are now joining us. This is a new program that we will have here right here on 107.1 FM once per week with President David Arthur Granger and Nancy Webb Education. We will invite others as well to ask questions about the village movement across the country indeed. But I recall before we get in to the meat of the program, as a youngster growing up, you hear this word about Nancy story. Come on, man, you're talking a Nancy story. What's the difference with that Nancy story and Anansi?
I think the meaning has degenerated over time. Some books and some countries still preserve the real meaning of Anansi, but some people in Guyana feel that Nancy story is something far-fetched, something that is impossible. Here you have a weak insect outsmarting a snake or a lion. That's impossible. But it is a story that we teach our children so they can learn that being weak or poor is not a disadvantage. It could build a strong nation, and this is exactly what our forefathers did against the planters, the white planters, and they suffered and they struggled and they built 100 villages. And this program will study how those villages came to be acquired or bought, and it should inspire us, encourage to preserve and protect those villages for our children, our posterity. So Anansi's story is not far-fetched. It happened in Guyana for over 180 years, and it is still happening now. We are Anansi's descendants.
Absolutely. The clever, the intelligence of that spider, Anansi. And so this program here, the inaugural of Anansi Web Education, is to talk about the villages, the village movement, and so forth across Guyana. Lots of history, rich history that we want the younger generation to know and to understand what really transpired and what is the reason for these villages that they are able to be in those villages to turn out to be lawyers, doctors, farmers, and teachers, and so forth. Mr. Granger, let's touch on the significance of the village movement. Can we begin with that, please?
Well, that is a good place to start, because without the village movement, we would not have been here. What happened is that after the period of enslavement, which is, it was really a crime against humanity. And as you know, later this year, 2023, we will observe the 200th anniversary of the Demerara Revolt, which is one of the most significant events in world history for destroying the system of enslavement. And quite frankly, the matter that we're discussing today should start with the emancipation movement, which came to fruition on the 1st of August, 1838. And because of that, as you know, Indians started to come here in 1838. Portuguese came here a few years earlier in 1834. Chinese came here in 1853. And many of them benefited from the foundation that the Africans had created in rural villages. Now, the village movement itself was a process in which the Africans who yearned for liberty, they yearned to be free, wanted to get away from not work, not the plantation, wanted to get away from the punitive aspects of plantation labor and create freedom for themselves and their families. And that freedom was based on that four-letter word, L-A-N-D. And that is why land was so important, 180 years ago. It's important now that without land, the entire village movement could not succeed. You had to have land to build your homes. You had to have land to build your farms. You had to have land to feed yourself. You have to have land to build your schools. So it was the quest for land which coincided with the quest for liberty. They didn't just want to overthrow the plantation system. They wanted to set up a parallel free system. And they struggled for freedom, they struggled for emancipation, which was gained on the 1st of August, 1838. And within weeks, they started to remove their women and the children from the sugar plantation because the women were the heart of the family. And having them cutting cane is no way to build a family. And unfortunately, some other ethnic groups think that the Africans didn't like plantation work, they didn't like agriculture work, which is false. But we'll
Isn't
leave
that
that.
isn't that strange though that they would have this falsehood that Africans do not like to work, they don't like plantation work when our African ancestors did that for over 400 years for free.
Well, when you deal with racial hostility, you're going into a zone of stupidity, and it's difficult to argue with stupid people. I myself have been present at some of these functions, and I had to correct them. I mean, how did they feed themselves after they left the plantations in 1838? There were no supermarkets, there were no towns, and they had to eat what they produced or produce what they wanted to eat. And let me tell you this, that even in the 1960s, when Blackbush Polder was being established, the mostly Indian settlers that the PPP put on in Blackbush Polder at that time, they had to go into the Kildonans and the Leeds and the Dingwalls and the Gibraltars to get planting material to be planted in Blackbush Polder. The Africans were self-sufficient. And those persons who lived in the towns in the 1950s, the middle of the last century, would know that if you were looking for, plantains, those yams, cassava, dasheen, pumpkins, you really had to go to African villages to get those commodities. But they were abundant. They're producers of abundant commodities, farm produce. So they were an agricultural people. And the other myth that people do not will fail to explode is that most Africans live in rural areas. They feel that Africans are urban people. No. Most Africans live in rural areas. You go through, I can take you through 100 African villages, and that is where people have been born, and that is where they grew up. And many of the most prominent Africans, even a generation or two ago, Chancellor Keith Messiah, he's from Poor Drawing, or ministers, that have come from Firish, and I think the Chancellor Desiree Bernard came from Plaisance. And you will go through all of these villages and see that the villages produce a generation of very talented, highly educated Guyanese. So it is a serious travesty. It is a myth. It is a lie to say that Africans had no regard for rural life or agricultural life, because the opposite is true. That it is those very villages that sustained life during the difficult period and helped Guyana to become a major commodity exporting country 100 years ago. I mean, when you see the figures showing what was exported from Guyana to places like Trinidad and Barbados in schooners, you would be astonished. We were exporting mules and donkeys, we were exporting fish, ground provisions. And up to the 1960s, people remember that well-known Trinidadian calypsonian, Mighty Sparrow, speaking about the wonders of BG plantain. BG, of course, was British Guiana plantain, And so one BG plantain filled the pot. Of course, Sparrow had a double meaning to that. But most villages could only, as a necessity, could only eat what they produce. So it is a myth to feel that, or to say that Africans despise agriculture. It's quite untrue. Because up
Certainly,
to now, as I said, most Africans still live in villages. And if you
certainly.
want to do a census of all the Hope Towns and Daniels Towns and Queens Towns around this country, and you'll see that what I'm saying is true. Even though there may be a majority in New Amsterdam and Linden and Georgetown, they are most Africans still do live in the countryside.
All right. If you're now joining us, Anansi Web Education with former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Arthur Granger. Mr. Granger, you did mention something that when Black Bush Polder was created in the 1960s and so forth, folks had to go to other villages like Kildonan and Dingle. A lot of folks are not familiar with those areas, especially out there in Dingle and so forth, Evesham and Epsom. In another program, because this will be ongoing, we will talk about those villages as well. The other thing before I have you touch on the importance of land and ownership of land. We obviously that we got that as demonstrated by our African ancestors, the importance of the ownership of land. Before we get to that question, though, you did mention that a lot of famous Guyanese are actually from the country. Former Chancellor of the Judiciary, Kit Messiah,
Two,
former Chancellor,
two chancellors.
two chancellors also,
Yeah,
former Chancellor Desiree Bernard
there's
from
Bernard.
Plaisance. And just to let our listeners know, we will touch on Plaisance, quite relevant, but we will touch a little bit on Plaisance shortly. But you did say that there are famous African Guyanese who are not from the tongue, but the country. Give us a little background as to the origin of Granger, the Grangers. Country?
Well, I didn't want to get personal, but we are part of a migrant family. We are Bajans,
Oh,
actually. Both my uh, maternal and paternal, well, certainly my paternal grandfather is Barbadian, and my paternal grandmother is also Barbadian. But they were here since they were here for over 150 years. So I'm 100% Guyanese, but they certainly came. My grandfather was a cooper. He's no big shot. He's an ordinary cooper. He worked with his hands at a place called Curtis Campbell. Um, and he was a very prudent man and saved money and he built houses which we live in today. And that was, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. But we are the product of a migrant family.
Beijing. All right. Thank you so much for a little bit tip of that. Beijing, indeed. Land. You mentioned land and the importance of land, and the ancestors, or African ancestors, knew that when they pulled up to purchase. Talk about the importance of land.
Well, first of all, Africans came from an agrarian society in West Africa. Wherever they came from, some are of uh, Akan, origin, some are Yoruba origin, some are from different uh, communities, Hausa, Igbo, and other origins, mostly in West Africa, which were very progressive agrarian societies. They were involved in trade and barter. They were involved in the production of commodities. And also gold, for example, Akan gold, is one of the reasons why the Portuguese and the English went to the West African coast. And of course, they went there to extract slaves. But they came from societies which lived off the land. And although they were forced into a form of labor on the plantations, they had to feed themselves. Because during the wars, the European wars, ships could hardly reach here, reach Guyana colonies. So they had to produce, things like cassava and yams and so on to sustain themselves. And and of course the Dutch, whatever meals the Dutch, food the Dutch provided was very scant. And soon they learned to mind their own chickens and produce their own crops. And it was because of their confidence in their ability to produce their own food that they took the bold step, not only in fighting for emancipation in 1838, but in leaving the plantation. So they didn't go to avoid. They knew they were going to go onto land, and that land was going to produce food, and they were accustomed to producing food. And during the period of apprenticeship, that is between, say, 1834 to 1838, they were able to uh, start production of some small animals, pigs and poultry and so on, and also to grow crops. So that's how the Sunday market came into being, because they would go and exchange um, those commodities for other commodities that they didn't produce. And after emancipation, the government then had to introduce coinage, because during enslavement, there was no need for money. Slaves were not paid. And when coinage was introduced, and those days coins had real value. A guilder or a shilling was made of real silver, and they stored that. They were prudent people, they were thrifty people, and they were able to buy land because that land was their future. It was production, it was family home, it was the farm, it was where they would spend the rest of their lives and what they would hand over to their children. On the plantation, they could hand over nothing. But once they had a village, that village brought into being a form of organization, of village management. And not only did they produce those, what they call the four pillars, that is the home, church, school, and farm, on which all the villages rest up to now, but they also had to produce the structure of managing the village. And this led to the whole development of the local government system, in which village chairmen were elected, and women participated fully. And people from the other Caribbean countries, late in the 19th century, would come to Ghana to learn how we were managing our villages so effectively and so efficiently. So land was the key. The problem is, and I think we shouldn't overlook this, is that a lot of the coastal land was low. And Guyana's coast is low-lying. It is susceptible to floods now as then. Then it was worse. And because of that low level, they were flooded every year. And you know very well in Guyana, the two greatest floods in recent memory were in 2005 and 2021 under the PPP administration. So it is nothing new. But the problem is that the villages did not control the drainage and irrigation system. The plantations had a network of canals. And I think one historian calculated that when you measured all of the middle walks and this, sidelines and the gutters and so on, it really came up to about 50 miles of, of guttering, of drainage, just for 1 square mile of estate land. But the villagers did not have that. Some were cotton estates which did not have the sort of drainage that the sugar estates had. So drainage was a big problem. And I must point out, even at this stage of our series, that in the last third of the 19th century or so, the African population in the village was actually falling. And that is why the Bajans came, because cholera and dysentery and other waterborne diseases were taking a toll on the African population, because they were neglected by the planters, and sometimes the planters deliberately flooded the black villages to drive them back to the plantations. So it was not a scene of peace and tranquility and cooperation. It was conflict. Here you had a planter class, which historians call a plantocracy, which was trying to control cheap African labor and the population. And here you had free Africans who were resisting that control and were determined to set up free villages. And that is why they started to bring so many immigrants. But it was to fill the vacancies created by the African deaths, in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, that people like my grandfather came to Guyana from Barbados and other places. Some came from the West, other countries in the West Indies.
One of the things that you did mention, and I'm glad that you walked us through the importance of, and what our African ancestors endured in terms of ownership of land and the purchases of those land or land, sorry, was basically to pass on to future generations. And that's a very, very important subject that we will touch on. But you did mention, as we look at time here, you did mention the market setup, the weekend, Sunday and Saturday markets and so forth started during that time. That's new to maybe a lot of people, that our African ancestors actually started that market setup.
Well, it was natural for them because there is something called a division of labor, and some people may be good at growing, ground provisions. Some people produce fruit, some people produce livestock, and some people develop craft. Some people learn to preserve food. Some people make beverages, and as a result of that, people had things to exchange, and that is what a market does. A market provides a platform for exchange of commodities. So those of us who produced poultry, for example, could carry our poultry to the market. We can get currency, which was called specie, silver or copper, and we could buy pork, for example. And those who had pigs or sheep could produce, could buy cassava or dasheen or yams and those. So this is what happened. People brought whatever they did produce and brought what they could produce and bought what they couldn't produce. And that is why so many African villages had markets, Pleasant, Buxton, and of course, big market in Stabroek. But this was a phenomenon, I think, up to the mid 19th century. Even, but those days, you can get craft because a lot of people in the villages were craftsmen working on the plantation during the week. I mean, my grandfather was a cooper. He was no PhD, but he worked with his hands. But it meant that he could make bats, he could make donkey carts, he could make wheels. And if people wanted things repaired, they could find almost everything they wanted in the village in those markets. So markets were ubiquitous. Some were just on the street, but some actually became buildings. But the land gave them the ability to produce crops. The land gave them ability to build churches. That was important. Going to church on Sunday is very important. And there's some villages you couldn't make noise on a Sunday. The villages drive you out. But the churches, the schools, this is something which is underestimated. That many of the churches in rural Guyana, British Guyana, were congregational churches, because during the time of enslavement, it was the congregational churches, not the Anglicans or the Catholics, the congregational churches, which stood by the Africans and actually produced the first pastors. But they needed land to build those churches, and some of those churches were built by self-help. Some of the schools were built by self-help. So the church, the school, the home, and the farm, and most of the farms were back dams. That is the importance of back dams. And maybe in a later program, we could look at the size of those back dams. They were huge, and they fed not the communities and villages, they fed the nation, um, because of the sheer size. And people would go in the corriales or bateaux, as they were called then. The French word bateau is a canoe, and go up the canals, and they all farm their produce and bring them out in time for markets. Now, before we close, I must tell you this, that this whole back dam philosophy was based on the fact that the villages were laid out in a logical way. This wasn't a set of people just coming off the plantation, grabbing land. All of the villages were laid out in a logical and legal way, even though some of the proprietors were not literate. This meant that people were given a house lot. Hear this? Um, Family was given a house lot in the front part of the village. They were given a farming plot in the back of the village, and they would probably be given a third plot of land. Of course, this created problems because all the land wasn't together. So a person would have to leave his house to go to his farm some distance away. And when that person died or children went away, sometimes the lands were abandoned. And that is what is happening now. People are trying to claim that lands which were abandoned did not belong to the owners of the land, which is false. The villages were units, but they were divided among the original proprietors. Now, in the case of Plaisance, which was bought in 1842, there were only 65 proprietors. So, of course, 65 proprietors, will eventually die, and there'll be more than 65 children. And this created a problem for children property and the division of the property. On another program, we can look at that, but all I'm saying is the villages originally were very logically laid out. There were several types of villages. One was the communal village, in which all of the proprietors would contribute money to buy a village, which became property of all of them. And those were collective, and some were actually proprietary villages in which each owner, proprietor, would own his portion without reference to the others. So you had two types of villages. And of course, the communal villages tended to run into legal problems later on. This sounds a bit complicated now, but later on we'll explain.
Well, certainly one that, sorry, go ahead.
The important thing is that land was seen as the key objective to liberty. Land and liberty were inseparable. And the original proprietors felt they could not be free unless they owned land. And I would say that is the lesson for 2023. Villagers in Guyana today cannot be free if they dispossess themselves of land. Land is life. Land is liberty. That is the message of Anansi.
Land is life. Land is liberty. I'm glad that you briefly touched there on Plaisance, because that seemed to be a hotbed where folks who have been on their ancestral land for quite a long period of time seem to be under threat. So we will touch on other villages in subsequent programs of this inaugural Anansi Web Education. Anansi Web Education. Again, thank you so much, former President David Arthur Granger, for this half-hour program. We will continue next week, and in subsequent weeks, we will have also other folks to join in this conversation about the village movement and the purchasing of villages and so forth by our African ancestors, and the importance of land. Anything before you go quickly?
I would like to congratulate you on launching this important educational program. I think it's important for all Guyanese to understand where we came from, because the model that was created in 1839, and that's the reason why when I became president, I declared for 7th of November every year to be celebrated as National Day of Villages, National Village Day, is that all of us, Indians, when they came, they saw this model. Chinese imitated the model, and they had a settlement of the Demerara River at a place also called Hopetown. So there were Indian villages, there were African villages, there was an attempted Chinese village, and of course the indigenous people had their own villages. But it served as a model, and it was on that model that the Guyanese nation was established. In fact, the villages helped to transform Guyana from a British Guyana, from a plantation into a free nation. That is the importance of land, and that is the importance of the African village movement.
Thank you so much, word of the wise, coming there from President David Arthur Granger. We will be back next week, same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. And thank you, all of our listeners as well, for tuning into this new program, Anansi Web Education, with former President David Arthur Granger. We will, like I've said, we will return next week, same place, same time, on this very station. Have a great rest of the night. God bless.
She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frock, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For them